Welcome to the Art of Growth and the Driven to Drawn panel series that we are doing right now. Special shout out to the Type 5s this week. This series has been all about how we are driven, often by our type, until we become conscious of what is going on, and we shift to the intentionality of being drawn by the high side of us, the light that we have to bring. Here at the Art of Growth, we use the Enneagram and the best tools we can find to help people transform, to help people communicate better, to have better self and social awareness. And lately, we've been able to do this a lot with some companies. Just in the last week, I've spoken with several different companies about how the Enneagram and the self and social awareness that it can provide is helping their teams grow, helping their teams connect and be more efficient in that. So if that's something you'd be interested in having us do for your organization, you can reach out to us at theartofgrowth.org. If you're new to the Enneagram and you haven't taken an Enneagram test or an instincts test yet, you can do that at theartofgrowth.org as well. We even have a store on there now, and we made a mug that I like because it says grace precedes growth. And the idea seemed silly to me at the time, but it's actually nice to have a little reminder there with you in the morning with your coffee that that's who you want to be and that's where you're starting out. So check all that out at theartofgrowth.org. But for now, my friends, let's jump in with the Type 5 panel.
Well, welcome to the Type 5 panel for this podcast we're calling Driven to Drawn. And I am so excited to have each of you. Why don't we begin by having you introduce yourself? Tell us where you're from.
I'm Robert Wallace. I live in Virginia, but I'm really from California and Brazil. Third culture kid. It's kind of like asking a military brat where he's from. Sort of a little complicated.
Yeah.
I'm Stephen. I live in Philadelphia and have lived around the East Coast, but Philadelphia has been home for a long time now.
I am Jackie. I live in upstate New York.
I'm Hope, and I live in Texas. I've lived here for a little over 16 years now. I moved out to marry my husband, and we've raised our family here.
Wow. Well, welcome to each of you. This is an interesting series because we're talking about something that doesn't get a whole lot of attention in the world of self-help or self-development. And that has to do with the positive side of growth, which is not only focusing on what has to change, which of course we do, but also on what is the high side of our type? What is the gift of our type? Can we move from that drivenness from whatever that core need, the core pain is, to the drawn, which is the aspirational and has more inspiration to it and more dream and hope to it. So I would love to begin with each of you. If you could describe to me what it's like for you. Let's start with the driven. What is it like for you to be driven? What does that feel like internally? What are you doing? We'll start there, see where that takes us.
I think when I thought of this, I thought of driven in terms of the passion of the 5, which is avarice. And avarice in the sense that, we're clinging to that which we might lose as opposed to just simply greed. And I thought perhaps the best way to describe this, because as I was grasping for ways to describe it, there's a sense of like a choking sense of loss, of impending loss in the drivenness of what's inside me. And when my first daughter was born, and I was out on a golf course just after my daughter was born. And it was a beautiful Saturday. What's not to like about this? And I was kind of getting into it. And I had this moment, a quiet moment that just hit me. And all I can say was like a cold fear that just gripped me. And it was as if I saw and was terrified at what I might lose the rest of my life. That my wife and my daughter were back home. And here I was with a bunch of guys walking around a golf course. And I'm thinking, Robert, what the hell are you doing? Like, why are you even here? And all I can say is I think, the essence of the 5 is that ability to see clearly with precision and to see something that is real. And in fact, what we see with our minds tends to almost in some cases be more important than the reality that's right in front of us.
Yep.
And so I was seeing, the saying, your life passes before your eyes, right? And I saw myself losing all the years of relationship with my daughter. And all I can say is I walked off the golf course that day and never went back. And it's one of the decisions I least regret in my life. So all the energy of that moment was negative. It was all this fear-driven, my life's about to go down a path that's irreversible. And there was just this choking fear, and the drivenness of, and I conceive of the drivenness of that moment as actually achieving something, it was negative, but it actually ended up achieving something beautiful, which was decades of a wonderful relationship with my family and not playing golf. So I think in my mind, I can think that drivenness need not necessarily be a pejorative term in its completeness, because I think, our egos defend ourselves. And in that moment, it defended me and actually wound up being something good. But the energy of that moment was negative and what I'm associating with drivenness.
Thank you.
Yeah, when I think of being driven, there's two very different and distinct ways that manifests for me. Sometimes it's a feeling of being frantic. There's so many things to do, and I'm aware of like a huge to-do list, and I feel like I have very limited resources in which to address those things. And so I bounce from thing to thing, and it feels physically frantic. Like at times I'll feel my heart racing, like there's just how in the world am I going to accomplish all these things? There are other moments where the impending drivenness actually leaves me feeling withdrawn, because I will say, you know what, before I get to that frantic spot, let me pull back. Let me kind of create this cocoon around myself. Let me protect myself so that the resources aren't sucked out of me. And I'll think, okay, I gotta, it may be relationally, I gotta cut my losses. I gotta step back before I get trampled or pulled into something that's more than I can handle. And so again, there's a physical feeling like I can feel my body pull back. When I'm able to be aware of my body language, I'll notice I'm crossing my arms in a conversation, or I'm looking down, or it manifests itself in my body as I'm just trying to deal with all of the demands that are the drivenness. Feels like I'm being pushed by those things.
Yeah.
Well said.
Yeah, I would definitely agree with that. I can relate a lot to that. A couple weeks ago, I was listening to a trauma conference, and Gabor Mate said this thing that I had to write down right away because I couldn't believe he said it, because this was coming up. But he said, "Are you following your calling or being driven? If you're being driven, you're not in the driver's seat."
Ooh.
Okay. All right.
All right. Okay. Now we're talking.
That's preach.
Yeah. So I rewound it. I was like, what did he just say? So just the idea. Yeah. I was thinking for me when I'm in that, and I really related to what he was just talking about with kind of it could be this really frantic or this withdrawing. But for me, it feels like I can't do it. I can't not do it. I don't have a choice anymore. There's not freedom of movement or choice. It's just, there's this pressure that I feel, and definitely attention. And for sure I have an agenda with what's going on. So those were kind of the words that came to mind for me with it.
Hope, I will say you summed up really well what I feel, which is I can't do it and I can't not do it. It's too much for me, but I have to throw myself into this somehow. It's like this overwhelming feeling of I'm responsible for this. And for me, again, as a 5, where I go to is, all right, well, the only way I can do this is if I completely ignore my own needs. I just like make myself as small as possible and just pour out to whatever is around me. Then maybe I can accomplish it, but I feel like it is just going to leave me so dead and dried out to do it.
Yeah.
I think that it definitely has something to do with control. Sometimes you just feel like you kind of lost that sense of I've got to hold on this, and I feel like I'm being kind of swept in a current, and I've lost a little bit of my footing.
Yeah.
Or sometimes you're just kind of floating. It's not even being swept along in the currents, just floating, and you kind of lose your sense of focus direction.
Yeah.
Does anybody else have the sense of being of the sense of being smothered by events and having to just do something to relieve that pressure? I think of the impetus to do something comes from this negative sense of being my resources. I think Stephen said it, my resources, I feel my resources being sucked out of me. And if I don't act now, I'm going to be in a really bad place.
Yeah. The smothered isn't quite the word I would use, but I get where you're coming from with that, Robert. For me, it feels more like, rather than something crushing me, it feels like everything's being sucked out of me. It is this, I'm just so empty. And, for me as a sexual 5, the place that I try to get energy is in connection with someone. And when I feel like the people around me are demanding things of me instead of giving things to me, it's like, well, the place I would go to be resourced is a one-on-one connection. And yet my one-on-one connections are demanding things of me. And so it's like, I don't know where else to turn.
Yeah. Well, you just described the quandary that sexual 5s have because of that instinct that works contrary to what the internal drive of the 5 is. So, yeah.
I think drowning might capture a little bit more for me than smothering. I'm trying to keep my head above water, and it's getting overwhelming.
Yeah. I guess one of the places I thought of the smothering is in social contexts, and is just feeling like your tank is too much. Like there's a point at which, and it doesn't have to necessarily be social context. There are a lot of other things that can suck our energy out of us, but social contexts for me are ones where it's most obvious, where that's what I mean by the smothering. It's just like too much is upon me. And I'm very social. I'm a social 5. And so social events really draw a lot out of me, and I love them. But then there's a moment where I've got to do something to relieve the sucking that is happening.
I can definitely relate to that, Robert. And I find myself sometimes, and I try not to be rude, but sometimes I just have to walk away. I just walk away.
Yeah, there's a joke about 5s just like suddenly just walking away and disappearing, and no one knows where the 5 went. It's there'll be an event, a party or something, and it's like where'd she go? So just walked away because you had to.
I did feel though that the feeling that really was strong for me, and I don't know if anyone else feels this, is fear. There's no question that there's fear that there's like this restlessness. The drivenness feels restless, and it feels like restlessness driven by fears. And there could be any number of fears of failing the people I love, fears of saying something I shouldn't say right now because I'm just tapped out. And it feels restless. I think, Stephen, you said something like that as well, just that there's just so much happening in this moment, and I just need quiet. And I will, walk away, or, but that's what the drivenness feels like. It's attached to fear, for sure, for me.
The thing that you said in that, Robert, that resonates with me is it's that fear of, because I can't sort of step back and think about this, I'm going to say something that makes me look incompetent. And competence is crucial. Like whatever else happens as a 5, I cannot be incompetent.
Does it feel to you that it just, because of the drivenness to both be competent, and yet in that moment you're overwhelmed, you're trying to survive, and you're feeling like, I can't say, if I say something, I'm going to appear incompetent. And it creates this sort of spiraling downward, as it were, it sounds like.
I think of words like harried or like off balance, just not sure-footed.
Yeah, I like that. Off balance feels exactly right, Jackie.
I think one of the things that off balance and not sure-footed. And then, because we want to fill things up with our knowledge in that moment, it can just feel like we say the stupidest things, because we're trying to gain footing, but with a mind that is not at rest. I know we're going to talk about being drawn, but when the mind is restless and full of fear, and then the mind is coming to the defense of the ego, that's not a recipe for good things.
I'd be curious how many of you relate to that, because he said we, but I'm wondering, is that more of a like how you embody the type, or is that do the others resonate with that, or would you nuance that differently?
I would say I tend to, if I'm feeling the frantic, probably before I'll say things that aren't thought out, I'll go toward withdrawing. So that's kind of like the counterbalance to my franticness, is I just go straight into withdrawing and shutting down.
I think that's true for me in a lot of ways too, Hope. Like you, I think Jackie, we were talking a couple minutes ago about someone's going to look around, where'd Jackie go? And for me, I do that in my mind. Like I will physically still be there, but I will stop talking. I will in many ways stop even interacting. I will just like shut down in that situation and go through things in my mind to try to regain some inner sense of, all right, what do I actually know? What can I actually stand on? What actually feels secure? Because there's too much happening and I'm overwhelmed by it.
I've heard some 5s describe it as both the withdrawing happens naturally, but it happens either physically or it can happen mentally, or it can be both. Now, there's one that was telling me I literally can be in New York City and I withdraw in the middle of New York City. I can talk, and it actually helps because no one's paying attention and they're just walking by, and I can just sit on the steps and disappear internally. So it's good to know that, because not all, it's not just that 5s may walk away from a party. 5 could be inside the party, but has evacuated internally.
100%. I think at least I don't know if I speak for others, but I agree with that. I can withdraw no matter where I am.
So let's talk about what it's like then for you, and maybe even, pepper in some stories of how it shows up for you when you are drawn. What's the energy like? What are you doing? Maybe some examples of that.
I know for me, part of what I feel like when I'm feeling drawn is the curiosity and eagerness to learn of a 5 is paired with a delight in sharing that knowledge. So it's not just the sort of hoarding avarice. I want to acquire as many facts as I can, but I want to be in the midst of people sharing what we're learning, bouncing ideas off of each other, learning from each other. That happens at a good day at work. If I'm, in a meeting where we're problem solving something together, and I don't feel like there's some external pressure to get something done. It's just, no, we're in a room nowadays, a virtual room, whatever, but we're together kicking ideas around and just firing on all cylinders, just like feeling like, yeah, each of us is listening to and connecting with each other and building on each other's ideas. And there's just this delight in learning things together.
I love it. Beautiful.
There's an element of just this kind of freedom, free, relaxing, creative excitement that happens in those moments.
For me, the drawn, we were at a beach house this Christmas and with family. And so there was family and other friends there. And so there was a lot of people, and I was tapped out at times, whereas, extended is quite a bit socially, but it was fun. It was family. I loved it. But I recharge on my own. And so there was this moment where I just felt a little bit of that drivenness of, I have got to get out of here. I need to go to the beach. I need to take a walk. I just want to be alone. And as I paused, though, something my wife had said earlier in the day, she said, hey, if you go to the beach, why don't you take the boys with you, meaning our grandsons? And I had this moment, a pause where, and for me, the drawn, I'll start by saying this, the drawn often happens for me in a pause where there's just a quietness. And in that moment, I thought about taking my grandson to the beach, and I thought, well, that's exactly not going to be a quiet walk on the beach. And yet there was just this moment of quietness where I felt just the whisper in my soul. And for me, the drawn feels like a quiet joy. Like there's a moment of clarity that, and I think if the fives, if we do have that, if our essence is about clarity and seeing things clearly, then in that moment, in a positive way, I saw my grandson and I thought, why would I not want to be with my grandson? And I just thought, yeah, I'm going to take him. And there was just this peace. There was just this peace of having leaned into this call. And it was amazing. I took him to the beach. We just chatted through the phone. Again, it wasn't a quiet walk on the beach, but in my spiritual tradition, there's a story of Jesus after a long day work, and the disciples are pushing the kids away. All the children want to get to Jesus, and the disciples are basically saying, beat it. It's like, hey, the dude's tired, get out of here. And yet Jesus in that moment said, no, let the children come to me, because the kingdom of heaven belongs to such as these. And I just had that feeling of pressing into a moment. And so what my ego wanted to do was a quiet walk on the beach. That was the driven part of me. But this calling happened in the quietness. And I guess that's what I would say, that the thing that came to me when I thought about being drawn, I thought there's a calming, there's a sense of peace, and there's a quiet joy that of a certainty that what I'm about to do is the right course. And usually it's in opposition to what the drivenness felt like.
Yeah, I think for me, it's definitely like, if the driven has an agenda, it's not having an agenda. To be able to just be in that calm and trust that what is going to unfold, what's supposed to unfold, will unfold. And it just feels very invitational, and I don't have that sense of pressure about anything. So it's lovely when it's there, and I would love for it to be there more often. And there's no fear. It's not associated with fear whatsoever.
I hope that captures well my feeling in those moments too. It's the absence of fear. And it is a sense of, I feel the abundance of the universe. I feel like there is plenty, and I don't have to be worried about it. There's room to fail if I fail, but there's also buoying up that makes failure less likely. So it's like, it's going to be okay if this doesn't work, but it feels more likely that it will.
Wow.
You drew a parallel there that was really beautiful. It's almost like driven is scarcity and drawn is abundance.
That's,
Ooh.
I mean,
Yeah.
for me as a 5, absolutely is that feeling.
Wow.
That's cool.
Yeah.
But, for me, just from a physical perspective too, like driven feels tight and drawn feels light. Like my whole body feels lighter when I'm relaxed into drawnness, as opposed to, no, I got to like knuckle through whatever I have to be driven through.
Yeah.
I love that. I think it's Russ Hudson says, in the moments of growth, when the 5's at his or her best, that in a sense the mind becomes the servant of the heart. And I think when you talk about the body, the mind becoming the servant of the heart and the body, I feel like the drawing can even happen from our bodies as well. That our bodies can be calling us to a better place. And I heard someone here recently talk about the idea of relating to our bodies as a separate individual. And this was a new thought for me. I guess it's been out there a while, but it was new for me. And this thought of being drawn by my body to a better place. And in the same way that for most of my life, I thought of this sense of drawnness in a spiritual sense as mainly a mental, something that happens in my mind and some kind of disembodied thing. And yet I think pathways to health for me have always included the body. And I'm self-pres is the least of my instincts. So, I have to really focus on on self-preservation. And yet, as I've done that over the last few years, I have felt my body calling me to better places. And I think in those moments of feeling drawn to health, drawn to relationships, drawn to moments that feel full of peace and feel full of joy. And yeah, like I think what some people just said, that there's going to be abundance. There's a certainty of abundance and not of scarcity.
You know what I love? When you're talking about this and all of you are talking, there's a shift from when you're talking about the driven, and then when we're in the drawn space now, I can feel your heart. I can feel the beauty of that. Even in this moment, as you're talking right now, I feel your heart. And it's so cool.
Especially in learning in the last few years about being a 5 and this idea that I'm so up in my head, and kind of almost the antidote to that is getting more into my body and paying attention to that, paying attention to cues from it. So I've been really trying to intentionally address that and become more aware of it and trust what's going on in my body more. So yeah, it's nice to see fellow 5s on the same journey.
Yeah, they're in good company.
I just can't help but think of when you're being drawn, that sense of the moment, to experience that and being in the middle of it. And just, you have this just sense of,
yeah,
it feels good. Feels good.
Yeah.
When I'm driven, it does feel like it's all in my head. I've got to sort everything through. It's all in my brain. And the drawnness feels so much more integrated with the heart and the body all working together, all in harmony, like these, 3, can't do it with my hands, but these 3 things kind of all rotating around each other. This it feels holistic as opposed to fractured.
That's great.
It's the right balance.
Yeah.
It is balance, isn't it? Because you're having the compartmentalization is natural for the 5. Sort of, having things outside of yourself is natural. The integration, when it happens, it feels magical, and it doesn't ruin your capacity to still compartmentalize. That's one of your strengths, to still be able to order things, to put things in their right containers.
I was just thinking about just the sucking out, right? And in the driven, but with the drawn, it's like this life-giving force that's coming in, or maybe it's already there and I'm just tapping into it, but it's the exact opposite experience.
It is finding those inner resources that I didn't know were there when I was worried about scarcity.
I think for me, another aspect of being drawn is, I've thought of this in terms of the virtue of non-attachment for the five, and the sense of just not being attached to a given outcome in any given moment, not being attached to, well, even seeing the world in a way that, it's all vanishing, right? We're all going to die. and yet instead of that being feeling like a depressing thing, or one that would cause me to withdraw into cynicism and despair, when I'm drawn, that feels like oneness with everything. I mean, literally everything. And so it feels like my heart is broadened and expanded to feel at one with nature, at one with the people I'm with. It feels like in those moments I'm able to be present in a way that is really beautiful. And I think that idea of non-attachment for me has been helpful to hear the calling of this oneness around me. And that non-attachment leads me not to dissociate, but actually to feel included in everything.
Without having to grip tightly to anything, right? It's
right. Yeah.
I love that. Talk to me about the movement from driven to drawn. This is a little bit more difficult because, again, we're new at this. So we're trying to understand, what is it like to do that? Have you had any moments of being able to convert that, to move it from one where you saw yourself moving down that path of driven to then breathing and then pausing, as Robert, you mentioned, and then moving into more of the drawn space? And I think there's a lot of fluidity. I'm glad you brought that up to begin with, Robert, where there was a little bit of like, well, I started in the driven, but the driven actually produced something good. And I do think it's very fluid. It's a back and forth sort of thing that happens. And you can start in the drawn and end up in the driven. You can start in the driven and end up in the drawn. So I'd love to hear from you if you've had any insights into that movement and how that works for you.
A couple of things for me that have been helpful. And I think, Robert, you hit on a key word, which is the pause. I have got to create the space in myself between stimulus and response, between feeling overwhelmed, and instead of just being driven into that, like, step back, take a breath. There are practices I find helpful in my life. I do find physical activity is just a great way for me to quiet my mind and move my center into my body for a while, which helps with that. I find music or art or poetry, something that, for me anyway, stirs my heart, is another good way to get out of my brain, to just experience unmediated beauty in some way, pulls me out of my head and pulls me together. I have also just personally found I have a really simple mantra that I will repeat to myself, which is just, I have all I need. And just, sometimes when I'm hiking or running or driving and there's a lot of traffic and, whatever, or at work, I'll like step back and just in the quietness of my mind say, I have all I need. And that just creates that space for me to respond then out of abundance instead of scarcity.
Yeah, I think for me that pause, it's so critical. There's so many times where, what you said, Stephen, just even taking a breath, breathing and just allowing the moment to settle and not feeling the pressure to act and recognizing the drivenness that wants to act. I think I've gotten better at seeing that as a red flag. And that instead of triggering withdrawal, just triggering a pause.
Sometimes I think how I look at something, my perspective on what's going on, or even let's just say, oh, I've got all this housework I have to do. The house is a mess and I got to get it cleaned up. And it feels driven. It feels like it's not a pleasant feeling. But then if I change the way I'm looking at that and I say, when I get this done, when everything is put in its place and the environment around me leads to this place where then I feel like I step into the feeling of being drawn, the feeling of the environment then is ready for that, for me, then that whole cleaning experience turns into something different to me. Or that feeling when you wake up in the morning and you're tired and you start telling yourself things like, oh, I didn't get enough sleep. I don't feel like I've got enough energy for the day. Geez, I really don't want to go into work. And then you just say, wait a minute, wait. And you tell yourself things like, hey, it's a new day, no mistakes yet. You have the opportunity to be the best you can be today. Let's go. And it shifts for me. It shifts the way I then experience those moments.
Jackie, there was something else you said that I feel on my better drawn days is true of me, which is reminding myself to be, I think the way you put it is just to be the best me that I can be. There is nothing wrong about being a 5. There's nothing wrong with being focused on competence. There's nothing wrong with being analytical and able to put things into pieces and take them apart and put them back together again. I just have to be okay being me and not try to be something else.
Yes. Yeah. You just said something that's really very, very important for every type. And that is when we're in our drivenness, there's something we're trying to resist, reject, change by force in ourselves that we don't like. And oftentimes when we enter into that place of giving ourselves grace, accepting who we are, that there's a relaxing and it opens up to that drawn side. So some of your practices, Jackie, as you mentioned, getting up and noticing, it's huge to notice right away. What's online? What's the first thing that comes online in this computer of mine? The first thing that comes online is scarcity. It's that, I didn't have enough sleep. And I love that because that's the self-talk a lot of us do, is what I don't have to begin. And of course, it's epitomized in the 5. What I don't have, can't move forward. And to change that, to turn that channel to something else. Yeah, really good.
Stephen mentioned something else that I think is so important. He talked about walking and hiking. And I think just getting outside and doing a lot of, that's another way to engage our bodies, or at least it has been for me. I travel a lot for work. And so when I'm in a strange town, instead of sitting in my hotel room, just get out and just walking outside, breathing the air, seeing the birds. There's nature walks in almost every city. That the process of connecting with nature has been a huge, huge part for me of bringing a balance and really feeling the abundance of this world. When I'm out in nature, there is a sense of the beauty and the wholeness and the completeness and the wonder of it all. And it there feels like abundance because it is abundant. And it's been so transformative for me.
I would definitely agree with all the things that have been said with the idea of getting some kind of exercise in, going outside. I think music can do it. Journaling is one thing that's been helpful for me. Not even so much taking a lot of time to do it, but sometimes just naming, even if I just take a note in my phone, what I'm noticing within me. So whether it's, this worry about this going on, I'm frustrated about this, but just somehow giving it that name and identifying it helps me get a little bit of that distance from it to where it doesn't feel so overwhelming or drowning for me. So I found that to be really helpful. And my new thing is being compassionate towards myself.
Yes.
And Marshall Rosenberg talks about connection before correction. And so giving myself that empathy before I even come in and try to change how I'm thinking about it. And so I'm super big on quoting other people because they say it so well, but I really wanted to read this quote from Carl Rogers, where he says, "It becomes easier for me to accept myself as a decidedly imperfect person who by no means functions at all times in the way in which I would like to function. This must seem to some like a very strange direction in which to move. It seems to me to have value because the curious paradox is that when I accept myself as I am, then I change."
Isn't that, it's such a wonderful way
So great
to move us to the final question I want to fire out to all of you. That is such a beautiful way to think about this, is that it all is, and that's what we're all experiencing. And it seems like we're hearing that from a lot of other types too, is that when we're showing ourselves compassion, there is a shift. There's something that begins to change without any effort, without having done anything significant in that moment. And so I think that's a very, very appropriate way to wrap this section up. One last question. How can others, those particularly that you know who are close to you, help you to shift when you're in your driven state, to move into the drawn state? What are some tips you might give to our listening audience?
I know when I am feeling driven, the biggest fears are fears of scarcity and fears of failure or incompetence. And so the thing that I need from the people around me, or the thing that anyway is helpful from the people around me, is just a reminder that actually enough is abundance. As a 5, I think I need like a super large amount because my resources could be depleted at any point, but just the reminder that enough is abundance, and the reminder that I am loved the way I am, that I don't have to be competent to be loved. I am already loved.
Beautiful.
I guess I would answer it, and this is going to be for a very specific group that maybe might be listening. I would say 2 things, and this kind of comes from the religious tradition I came from, is number 1, don't try to argue us out of being our state of being drivenness. Of like, if you just engage our mind and tell us why it's stupid or wrong to be going down the path we're going down, that's engaging something that is probably not going to be helpful in the moment. And if you pile on top of that the whole paradigm of at least how I grew up is seeing everything in terms of sin and failure, and if you pile that on top, then what's probably going to happen in us is we're going to shrink, and we may kick back really hard, and we may lash out, but probably not. We're probably just going to withdraw. We're probably just going to be quiet and withdraw, and you're never going to have the opportunity to draw us out. And I just, again, this may be not for everyone, but there's a segment out there that interprets everything in terms of spiritual failure. And if you just interpret us and put us in a box of being spiritual, of failing spiritually, you're adding to something that is killing us inside and not drawing us.
I think for me, when you asked that question, I hadn't thought about that previously. And as I considered maybe some moments where I have felt the harriedness, the stressed, irritated feelings of being driven, and what maybe may have touched me to pull me out of that a little bit, I've thought about some different things that those around me, my loved ones, have done, and it made me think of the love languages. I have one daughter that's really great at coming up behind you and just scratching your back a little bit, or somebody giving you a little word of affirmation, or that act of service, or any of those things. And it helps me to shift back into the place I need to be. It kind of takes me out of the stress moment or the feeling off balance, and it recenters me. Mm. So I guess I would say that those little moments of those people around you showing their love for you.
Mm. Yeah, I would say what helps me is with this idea of drawn, right? Someone giving me an invitation and not phrasing anything like it's a demand. That really helps me be more wanting to engage, and helps me shift, and giving me the freedom to have some space to get my bearings for a little bit. So maybe giving me the offer of, why don't you, take 5 minutes to just go outside, get a fresh air, have a little time by yourself, but inviting. And then another phrase, there's an NVC trainer named Marilite, and she talks about this idea of, instead of asking what's wrong, to ask somebody what's going on. And so I think that phrasing for me would it would feel much more invitational. And as a 5, please give me lots of time to say what's going on.
Yeah.
Yes. Great tip for everybody listening. Yes. And that's important. I love how you're phrasing it, and a few others have phrased it similarly, where it's the invitation is rather than categories of, are you this, or are you being that? It's not helpful particularly for 5s, but it's not helpful for head types in general. It's much more helpful to have a more inquisitive, open kind of space. And that invites head types in. So this is a good coaching tip for everybody in relationship with head types, is start with interest, with openness, with curiosity, not boxing in, certainly not what's wrong. I love some of the stuff that has been already recommended, like, give a space to respond and make some suggestions. But love seems to work for every type. And so when we're given that, again, it's love, it's grace, it's compassion. These things are powerful, helping us to become our better selves. At least it brings us out of that hole sometimes that we fall into, brings us back to like a neutral place where we can make some better decisions. So with that, thank you to each of you so very much for having been on this podcast, for having shared, for having opened up. And so big thanks to each of you.
So thank you for listening. Thank you for joining us. It's always an honor to have these voices on who can help us continue in the learning process about the Enneagram and about each other. Make sure you are subscribed so you don't miss any episodes, and you can follow us at Art of Growth on Instagram. And if you leave us a review, it helps a lot. But for now, my friends, may you be very aware of the energy that is coming out from you and the ways that you can rebuild it. Be aware of the 5 energy within you that knows there is ways that you are here to be a resource and you want to use what has come to you well. May you be aware of how to re-energize yourself, to be prepared for anywhere you are invited to let your light and your gift shine. Grace and growth, my friends.